So this is section 13, and we have to deal with a number of nuisance and trespass cases, as well as Rule 13 of the Rules of Civil Procedure. Rule 13 deals with counterclaims. As a general matter, when you file your answer in a case, that you file along with it any affirmative defenses you have. And more often than not, if you have counterclaims, claims against the opposing party, usually claims filed by the defendant against the plaintiff, then they would be filed here as part of your answer and affirmative defenses, and then the counterclaim is filed as part of the same pleading as a general matter. We have two different types of counterclaims, as you know. Compulsory counterclaims and permissive counterclaims. Compulsory counterclaims arise from the same set of facts or circumstances as the principal claim that's been directed at the defendant, and because it arises from the same set of facts or circumstances, you're required to plead it at that point in time or potentially waive it. So a compulsory counterclaim, because it arises from the same set of facts or circumstances as the principal claim, must be pled in response to the principal claim, or it would likely be forever lost. A permissive counterclaim is the opposite. The only thing they have in common are that they're between the same parties, but it arises from a different set of facts or circumstances. It does not need to be brought in response to the principal claim. However, if it is not brought, you don't lose it. However, if it's brought, because it arises from a different set of facts or circumstances, it should have its own independent basis for subject matter jurisdiction. And as a practical matter, you know, the fact is that if you think it's questionable whether the counterclaim is compulsory or permissive, then you should be pleading it. Because what you don't want to find out down the road is, oops, you were wrong, it was compulsory, you didn't plead it. Now the plaintiff is going to argue res judicata when that claim is later brought against them, and they're going to say that that claim has been extinguished because of the failure to bring it earlier. So as a general matter, as a precaution, more often than not, if we have a counterclaim, we will try to assert it and bring it and make an argument that it is arising from the same set of facts or circumstances, or you have a separate basis for subject matter jurisdiction such that it can be brought in this proceeding. I mean, you know, a lot of what we do when we're practicing law is we practice law defensively. We don't want someone questioning our judgment down the road and potentially exposing us to malpractice claims. So you want to think long and hard about not filing a counterclaim when your client has a counterclaim to file. And the other reason why we would tend to look harder at counterclaims and the like is the best defense is a good offense. To the extent that the plaintiff has something to lose, they're more apt to assess their situation with a more careful eye than if all they have to do is gain by succeeding on their claim. Cross claims are part of Rule 13 as well. Cross claims, as we've talked about from time to time, they're not against the opposing party, the plaintiff in the case, if filed by a defendant. They are against a co-party. So usually two defendants may have claims against each other. Those are filed by way of cross claims, which is found in Rule 13G. Just because the claims are pled at the same time by way of the initial complaint and then a counterclaim doesn't necessarily mean that that case will go to trial, all the various claims at one time, because the court can, and again, part of Rule 13, order separate trials if it chooses to, if the claims are sufficiently distinct that would make more sense. So Rule 13 requires us, for the most part, to really take a hard look and make sure that if that counterclaim is compulsory, it absolutely is filed, and even if it's permissive, or you think it's permissive, to be very careful before you choose not to file it. It may be best out of an abundance of caution to file it even though you believe it's compulsory, because in defending that claim down the road, I and everyone else who's on the other side are gonna argue that it was a compulsory counterclaim and you should have pled it. Because that language arises from the same set of facts or circumstances, it isn't narrow, it's elastic. And so it can be read, and there are cases that would support a very broad interpretation of what that means. And so be careful if you're gonna not plead a counterclaim because you think it's likely permissive. The safer practice is to plead it, and then if they move to dismiss it because there's no separate basis for jurisdiction, and the court ultimately decides that it was permissive and you don't, then you still have the ability to bring that claim down the road because there's no adjudication on the merits. It's an adjudication that you didn't have subject matter, and if anything, you've got now an adjudication that it arises from a different set of facts or circumstances. If the other side was arguing against the court exercising jurisdiction, the likelihood is they were arguing that it was a permissive counterclaim. Now, you also likely have what we call judicial estoppel. They've taken a position in a case, and that they should be bound by it later down the road. So the safer practice pointer here is if you've got a counterclaim, you should file it. And from a standpoint of counterclaims, they generally are a good measure to make the plaintiff think harder about how far they want to take the matter to trial. As long as you can plead it consistent with Rule 11, you should. Questions on counterclaims? Then let's talk about our nuisances and our trespass. And, you know, in my own practice, my neighborhood, my town where I live now is North Andover. We live near the beach here. I've had cases with respect to this Peters versus Archambault. These situations happen all the time. So you've got to be able to think a little bit about them and how these would play out and what specifically the law is. So this first case is Peters versus Archambault. It's a 1972 case. It comes to us from Marshfield, which is a community that's on the, it's a beachy community, at one point mostly cottages and small lots and things like that. And these are adjoining oceanfront lots, and both lots of land are registered. Do you know what that means? I mean, did you discuss that in property, what the difference between land being registered and land filed at the Registry of Deeds means? Do you have some understanding of that?
Does that mean that it's been recorded?
Yeah, it's a recorded title, but what's that mean?
That it's been recorded with the Registry of Deeds that you are now the owner of that.
Well, but that would be, any deed I file is going to show that I'm now the owner of the property at the registry. But what is the difference? Have you guys thought or talked at all about? We have two places where land can be recorded in Massachusetts. One is the Registry of Deeds, and the other would be the Registered Land section. You have some understanding or appreciation of that? Did you deal with it? Did you deal with it in property or some conveyancing course or not?
Yeah, like last week.
Like last week?
We had that court last week.
You had what last week?
The course on recording.
The course in a week?
Well,
The section of the
Class.
course. Okay, in property?
Yeah.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Right.
Okay, so what did you take away was the significance of that?
Well, it depends. You have different jurisdictions. You have race notice, pure notice, and pure race. So there's three jurisdictions as to recording.
Okay, but I'm just trying to think basically, like, if you buy a house in Massachusetts, what is the difference between the land being recorded at the Registry of Deeds or registered land?
I don't precisely remember learning anything about the Register of Land. He probably did teach me. I'm not going to say he didn't.
Oh yeah, no, and it may be something. I know in property, don't they still worry about
Right.
wild animals and crap?
Right. So
Because this is what you should worry about, frankly.
So, from my understanding, the Register of Deeds, it really goes to real property in the sense that we're talking about a home and first in time, first in right to register to actually claim ownership of that property. Now, as far as the land use, my inference would be we're talking about wetlands and things of that nature, where we're talking about just an open space of land. And who technically owns that land. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that, well, I'll give you an explanation. In Massachusetts, and other jurisdictions as well, there's two places where you can find, or where you would record deeds to property. Okay, one is at the Registry of Deeds. Every county has one, and the deeds are simply filed there. So would any mortgages. So would any wetlands restrictions with respect to building and the like. And when we buy or sell that property, we write out a deed, someone signed under oath, the new buyer takes it, they run a title search, and then they give you the money, and that next deed is filed at the Registry of Deeds. So people can, it's public record information, and they can check it. But from time to time, we do have questions about, well, does that person really own it? Are there mistakes in the title? Are there claims of adverse possession where someone else says, no, I have a title? Were the mortgages all appropriately recorded or discharged? So you have a little more of a difficult task sometimes figuring out exactly who owns it, what restrictions come with it, and whether the transfers then are done free of that. And also with respect to the metes and bounds and the property description, all that, we try to be careful, but that's the Registry of Deeds. That's likely where most land is recorded, okay? We also have this other section called registered land. Now, the reason it is different, and it is the court is actually, in order to obtain registered land, at some point, there was a court adjudication of both the title to the property and the metes and bounds, the description of the property, what liens were there, who the owners were, and it's a court determination, just as we've seen before in other cases, res judicata and all of that carries with it. So the court actually issues an order with respect to that property. Anytime that property is then transferred, you have what we call a certificate of title. And that's transferred with it. The land court then updates it. They record the new owner. They record the deeds. You can see it quite cleanly on the certificate of title. It is better land, in essence. It's a confirmation of what you own and what restrictions and what mortgages and the like come with it, okay? So to the extent you have registered land, you get superior title, okay? And it's usually very clear as to exactly what that land is. But that's because it went through a court adjudication process. It's oftentimes, it would be done by the land court, so it is an adversary proceeding. Sometimes you have cases you bring to the land court because we've got a missing heir. Or, I had one where there was flaws in the background of the title. They sent my people a thing saying, hey, will you folks just sign off on this? We're confirming the title. And when we looked at it a little bit, well, the reason they wanted them to sign off on it is it was pretty clear that the mother's, say, 4 children, I think it was. So the mother's dead, but it was her siblings then who acquired the balance of the property. Well, with mom dead, that interest then passed to the 4 siblings. They wanted them to sign off. Well, then they're not going to sign off without some cash, because they're not just going to waive their rights. That's part of the reason why they're going through this court process, is to determine exactly who the owners of the land are. Well, there's some value to that. And so they would have, if they hadn't settled, they would have been able to go to the land court, argue that no, they take through their mother's interest was never extinguished, or they might have even been grandfather. It was kind of distant in time. It wasn't a straight one pass. But at the end of the day, they still have those rights. Now, if it wasn't registered land, they still would have had those rights. Someone might have picked up the flaw earlier, might never have picked it up. But when you're going through this court adjudicated process to make land registered land, it is an adversarial proceeding where they would have the right to come in, file their answer, contest the claims, and move forward from there. So when you buy registered land, What's really valuable about that is that you know that there are protections for it and that the property is exactly as described. You're not going to find down the road that the neighbor has some claim of adverse possession, or that the person who sold it to you, Jeeves isn't the owner, because it said Jeeves. I got his ID. Jeeves is the owner. He transferred it to me. I'm good. So there's additional protections for registered land. I had one time down in Quincy, and we were just what should have been a simple real estate closing. The properties had exist down there for 50, 60 years in exactly the same way that they were going to exist in the future. And the driveways were lined up like this, right side by side. You see sometimes like that in the city. And as it turns out, the boundary line wasn't like that. It was here. So my client, who was purchasing the house, if we couldn't resolve this, had no access to the house, no access to the driveway, no access to the garage. But the fact is, that's the way it's been for 50 years. So I called the neighbor, not the seller, because the seller wanted to get the deal done. And I said, listen, all we need to do is do a simple easement, and it's not going to be any greater than what's taken place for 40 years there. We just want to confirm that in fact is their driveway to use, because otherwise the bank's not going to lend to them. Person said, seriously, says, nope, I heard easements are a bad thing. Click.
Wow.
And here's the rub. Now, she had a claim for adverse possession, greater than 20 years, open, notorious, hostile, exclusive, yada, yada, yada. And we're going to see it in the first case as well. When the land is registered land, you cannot have a claim of adverse possession, because it's, again, this court adjudicated title to the property. So the fact is, we could have screamed and yelled and done whatever, just as they could have here, but what we had to do is walk away from the deal, because there was no way, frankly, you're going to be likely to be successful on that argument. And why should my people buy a piece of litigation that they don't have a snowball's chance of winning? They may not have even wanted, even if they had a good chance. And who the hell wants to buy fighting with your neighbor from the get-go? But neighbors fight a lot. So that registered land, that's another thing you got to be careful about. When people come in and say, oh, I've got a claim of adverse possession, and it's something people think, they even think they use the term. But a lot of times, neighbors don't know where the boundary lines are. And they don't, even if they think what they are, they're not where they are. I've had those disputes in Brayton. I've had them all over the place. I keep waiting in my own neighborhood for it to come up, because I was friends with the builder. He lived next to me for many years there. But everyone expects that the lots look like this, right? You know, sort of the house is situated square on the lot. He showed me that, well, that's not really the way the lots are at all. They lay out like this, even though the houses look like this. So virtually one whole side of the street, every lot line, the people are all over the place. And if neighbors don't get along, at some point they're going to have problems, because someone's going to say, that's not your, I don't want the kids' place swing set there. Pools pose a particular problem in this regard. The fact is that, you know, we have plot plans, but then builders get out there and they hit ledge, or they do this and they move the lines, and all of a sudden we've got the entirety of the development off kilter, and it raises all these problems of nuisance and trespass and potential adverse possession claims. Registered land, and that's what we're going to see in the first case, you can't have adverse possession claims against registered land.
So in essence, it's possible for a deed to be filed with the Register of Deeds, where an issue arises there, and registered land is sort of a remedy to
Yes.
that problem?
Yes, a lot, yes, but it's an expensive remedy. So I've got it, and I say, oh crap, we got problems with this title. We'll have to go to the land court to get them squared away. Yes, you can try and register it, but that's not going to be inexpensive. It's time consuming, and you need, you're still gonna need all the searches and everything done. What you're trying to do likely is confirm the title is yours and also extinguish other people's potential claims to it. And so it can be a lengthy process, but that's exactly right. The other thing is having registered land when you're purchasing it, or when the client's purchasing it, you're reviewing it. It's a lot easy with registered land than registry of deeds. There are people that specifically will do title searches and the like, and then you'll have title insurance companies that will issue policies on it. But the fact is, I could write you out a deed today to 500 Federal Street, the building you're sitting in. I don't own it, obviously. We could get it notarized. You could go down, pay your filing fee, and they would accept the deed. And you might think you own it, but you don't, because I didn't own it. And the fact is that anyone can file something like that at the Registry of Deeds. Land court becomes registered land, it becomes a lot less likely that can take place. Okay? Questions? Okay, so let's take a look at this Peters versus Archambault, because again, this is another one that I've seen a lot. But here you've got owners of adjoining lots of land, and so then we have an encroachment by the defendant's house on more than 9% of the plaintiff's small lots. And again, oftentimes this happens where the lots are relatively small. In beach communities, the lots are all relatively small. And then what happens, a lot of times too, is they started out as cottages, people build on, people don't, either they don't care or they don't know where their lines are, or they think they're somewhere other than they are, and all of a sudden we've got an encroachment. And so this encroachment was created by the defendant's predecessor in title 20 years before the plaintiff purchased their lot, and it no one had complained about it, just like those driveways in Quincy, until it was discovered by a survey shortly after the plaintiff's purchase. Removal of the encroachment would involve a substantial expense of the defendants. So 9% of their building is on their neighbor's lot. So is that a trespass or a nuisance? And I also, by the way, I was going to ask you, because since we're talking about adverse possession, you know the elements there?
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
What are they?
Oh, for adverse possession?
Yeah.
Yeah. Open and notorious, actual, exclusive, continuous, and hostile.
I know he teaches you the actual. I don't get that.
You must be actually on the land. You must have.
Well,
You must be-
do I actually have to be there, or couldn't I fence it off and it be mine? Do I have to be there for the 20 years?
I think if you could try to toll it, you could try to say someone else, or tack it, you could try to say someone else was on there before, and then.
But I mean, but when you say actual, does that mean I actually have to
You
be
have to
there?
be there.
Because I don't think that's the law.
I don't think it's actual. I think you have to just actually have a presence there. So that
Right,
means you
right.
can go to your vacation home down in Florida and come
Yep,
back.
yep. You
Right.
can come back, yeah.
So
Well, that's I know. See, we didn't have actual when I studied this, because open and notorious is what? Open and notorious what?
Open and notorious means that.
Open and notorious what? There's another word with that, isn't there?
No, I think it's just open and notorious possession.
Oh, possession. Okay, possession or occupation.
Right, occupation.
Okay, but so then what the hell do I need actual for? Aren't we a little redundant then? Listen, I have this discussion every year because I know you guys add an not you guys, Peter adds an actual, and if open and notorious possession or occupation, actual doesn't seem to add anything to me, but I know you need to learn it because I know he teaches actual. I'm just asking you to think a bit about it. But you've got the elements of it, and the hostile, right? It's got to be adverse to the owner's interest, and that's one question that we have here. So my other question though was trespass or nuisance.
Anyone who's on your land that that's not you is a trespasser.
So Ray can't come visit me?
No, not without
No,
your
really?
permission. No,
Oh,
not
so-
without your permission.
Okay,
You have to
so,
give them
but you,
permission.
that's not what you said. You said anyone on my land other than
Without
me.
your knowledge, then at that.
Wait a minute,
particular time-
Chief, slow down. Is it knowledge or permission?
Permission, I think.
Okay, okay. So,
That would create me to be an invitee.
right, so you could come on if you were invited,
Right.
right? Okay, or you had my permission to be there, right? Sometimes people give their permission for their land to be, someone to hunt on their land and the like, right? Or your garbage man might come into your yard and take your trash, whatever, okay. So wait a minute, so this was supposed to be trespass, so trespass is what?
Well, a hostile is anyone who's a trespasser on your land.
No, but we're not on hostile now. Okay, we're past your part about adverse possession. So now I'm trying to figure out what a trespass is and what a nuisance is. Like what, this one here, you've got 10% of the building on the neighbor's land. Trespass or nuisance? Or both?
Both.
Is it both? Okay, so what's a trespass, first of all, then you can tell me what a nuisance is.
Trespass is anyone that's,
No, anyone what? Anyone what?
any individual that's on your land without your permission is a trespass.
Well, is it, there's no individual here.
Or their property.
Well, so any what? Any property on my land?
Anything.
Is it anything? Well,
Because I remember even like smells can count.
Yeah.
mm-hmm. Okay, but I need a definition, guys. Because I agree, smells, right? When I was growing up, we lived near a huge automobile painting company. Back then, they'd do it inside, they'd do it outside, they'd do it anywhere they felt like, and you'd smell paint. And we were a little bit away, but you'd smell paint. So that's a trespass?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you define trespass?
Anything that encroaches upon your land without your permission.
Encroaches upon my land?
Interferes.
Interferes on my land? Or that sounds more closer to nuisance, no?
Enters.
Enters, so there's gotta be an entry. Do we agree on that?
An intentional entry.
Okay, an intentional entry onto the land of another without permission. Does that sound right? So the entry can be by anyone or anything.
Correct.
Was that where you're at? Okay. I can live with that. So, as Zach said, so smells could be,
Correct.
lights,
Correct.
right? There's old cases, used to be car lots and things like
I
that.
don't think we're running into nuisance when we're talking about lights.
We'll get to, okay, but the lights, could the lights both be a nuisance? You said any invasion. When you say invasion, do you mean I have to hit my feet to the ground?
No.
Or can I cast those lights onto the neighbor's land?
You can test the lights.
So light, what about sound?
Sound as well.
You all agree with sound? I don't like Jeeves' music. Listens to all that music late at night. Is that trespass?
I disagree with it being a trespass. It's more so a nuisance because we're talking about use and enjoyment of your property. So the noise is going to.
Okay, so the noise would be, and so what do we have for nuisance? You didn't give me that one yet.
It's any unlawful interference with the use and enjoyment of the land. That's the.
That doesn't sound bad. So how did you start again?
It's an unlawful interference.
Interference with the use and enjoyment of the land. Okay, okay. Well, couldn't the lights, oh no, you wanted to focus on the sound. Couldn't the sound be both? Couldn't the sound be what he just described as a nuisance, an unlawful, unreasonable interference with the use and enjoyment of the land, but at the same point, an invasion without my permission of my land?
Yeah, I think they could be both.
Well, Ray, how are you going to distinguish between Zach's smells and sounds?
I even think the smells is more.
Oh, you're not going to give him the smells either?
I even think smells and sounds and even the lights are more of a nuisance than they are a trespass because a trespass will require you to physically have some type of entry just because a light is going in there, that's not necessarily a
Well, when you say physically have some type of entry, that doesn't necessarily mean by a person, does it? I mean, couldn't the smells physically invade it? Couldn't the sounds physically invade it? You know, you gotta decide. A lot of times they go hand in.
I think the key to it
Yes.
is with, well, the lack of the owner's authorization for a trespass to actually occur. Whereas the nuisance is just involved in an unreasonable interference. So an unreasonable interference is the light, is the sound, the smell. That's unreasonable. As opposed to a trespass where it was really saying the person has to intentionally enter the person's
The land of another,
land
without the permission.
Without the permission.
Well, it doesn't. You keep adding person when you do that, and I'm not so sure it's person. That's where we're at. Do sight, do smells, do light, do sounds potentially constitute that invasion of another's land that could also be considered a trespass. My definition for nuisance, though, here does start out with it's a non-trespassory invasion on a private nuisance. Right? So it's not really the entry. You're doing something on your own land. And when we're talking trespass, we're talking about an entry. But couldn't sights and smells and sounds enter my land? You know, I don't think you guys have done it. We used to do an example from over here in Andover. My friends of mine had this big, huge farm. It was really nice, but it was mostly vegetable farm. But you know, vegetable farm, they put out cow manure all over the fields. And actually, our own house, we live near Farmer Barker's farm, that he would put out manure over all the fields. And it's nice. I come from the city, so country I would think is nice. No, because what he would do is take the honey wagon from the top of the hill where he had the cows, fill it up with cow manure, come down the street, and pull it into, and then distribute it on the fields. We're in our new house one of the first days in spring, and I'm sitting in my family room, which is above our garage. My wife's from Lawrence, I'm from Dorchester. I'm saying, the whole house smells like shit. And I said, what do you think, what's going on here? And what happened is, when I rode down the street in the car, the cow manure got all stuck in my wheels. We both then parked under the family room, and we're sitting in the family room smelling crap all night. Now, the city has its own problems, but farms bring a lot of nuisance and potential trespass problems with them. It's nice. It's, listen, I like it all, but I could see, and this is what happened. You guys don't do the example anymore. Down in Andover, farmland is a lot more valuable up here now as housing lots. So what they did is they sold off 10 acres to some developer. Developer built these big fancy houses. And then the people are there, and there are times where the smells are horrible. I guess if you grew up on it, it's one thing. Like the sounds in the city. If you're used to it, it doesn't bother you. But I knew these people would start to say, wait a minute, we want to shut the farm down, we want to do this. So you get questions of nuisance and trespass. Let's get to this first one. So what the argument here is that this is a trespass? Because it's a physical structure. It's not a person, but because that's the first thing I want to make sure we're all on the same page. For trespass, it doesn't need to be a person. It can be anything that's invading the land of another without permission, right? This is definitely a trespass, right? This one is a relatively easy one. We'll hold our powder on sights and smells and sounds, which, by the way, why wouldn't you plead both? Right? In the real world, well, I'm pretty sure it's a trespass, or I'm pretty sure it's definitely a nuisance, you know what? A lot of these sometimes border the line. Why don't I throw in another count for trespass as well? Especially with sights and smells and sounds, because I think sometimes, you know, I actually had one of the auto body cases, and what she was arguing, and it wasn't just argument because the health inspector went down there, there was not only could she smell the paint, but part of the reason she could smell the paint is that there were tiny particles of paint falling into her yard as a result of the operation across the street. And so I assume we would agree that's a trespass. Go ahead.
Same thing in your example that you were driving into farmland, that's both a trespass and a nuisance.
I think
Because-
I'm not sure it's a trespass because I'm not sure, because they didn't invade it, I took it there. No? Because it just struck me, first of all, I'm not, that's not, you know,
Right.
I like the country. I don't like that, but. But at any rate, no, is it though?
Well, you took the manure on your wheels.
I did.
But
It seems like,
unknowingly.
it
So-
seems like you probably should go to the car wash or
So
something.
that entered your land at that point.
But I brought it in. He didn't. I'm just saying, if I were him, I'd say, you live near a farm, you saw that the road was covered in poop, you drove on it and you put your car in your own garage. How is that? I would defend it on his behalf saying, that's not on me, that's on you. No, I mean, I didn't invade your land, you took it onto your land.
But where's the driveway?
My driveway?
It's on your land.
No, it's a public street.
Oh, it's-
Now, I still don't know whether he should have, but it's not, I mean,
so then it would be a public nuisance, right?
well, it's only if people complain, right? It's got to it'd be more people than me. And this was just something we weren't aware of. We got to do Peters versus Archibald. Zach says this is definitely a trespass, and it is definitely a trespass, right? The problem is, it's a relatively small house. They're really small lots of land, and if you're going to, and the plaintiffs want this removed from their land. There's no settlement deal, there's no limitation, they want it off. And by the way, a lot of times, these neighbor disputes get like this. I've seen tons of them. And at some point, they no longer talk to each other. It's not, and by the time usually it gets to us, it's beyond repair. And so here, what they want them to do is tear out 465 square feet of their home, of their neighbor's home. It says the encroachment contains 465 square feet. The building extends 15 feet 3 inches onto the plaintiff's lot to a depth of 31 feet 4 inches. So this is not a small encroachment. This is not an encroachment of what we would call de minimis, which might mean we have a different result. De minimis has to be a very, very minor or insignificant encroachment in order to avoid what's going to happen here. First of all, it says there has been no estoppel or laches on the part of the plaintiffs in seeking to have the encroachment removed. What's laches?
Purposely prejudicing the other side by delaying.
No, that's pretty good. And I'm not even sure the purpose is necessary, Zach. But it is maybe I'd say deliberate delay. It is a delay in asserting your rights that causes prejudice to the other side. That's laches. A delay in asserting your rights that causes prejudice to the other side. And I'm not sure you have to show intentional or deliberate, but just that the delay has now affected me. And when we say affected me, it just doesn't mean, well, now I'm inconvenienced to defend the suit. Generally, it's going to be the loss of evidence or witnesses, things like that. You've now, because of that delay, it has prejudiced my ability to defend this case. Estoppel, and both of these are classic equitable defenses, by the way. What's estoppel? Go ahead.
It's that you are stopped from your position, that you have asserted a specific position, and you are deemed to take that position.
Good, right? An estoppel is that because of a position you have taken, you are now prohibited from changing that position because I relied on what you did to my detriment, right? You're stopped from changing your position because it would be unfair to allow you to do that based on what I've done. And they're saying here, there's no estoppel and there's no laches. And so the question is, should the plaintiff be allowed to get the removal of this encroachment onto their land, regardless of what the defendant may suffer as a result of that encroachment? And the law in Massachusetts is pretty clear on this. It says here at Arabic 1, in Mass, a landowner is ordinarily entitled to mandatory equitable relief to compel removal of a structure significantly encroaching on his land, even though the encroachment was unintentional and negligent, and the cost of removal is substantial in comparison to any injury suffered by the owner of the lot upon which the encroachment has taken place. So even if it wasn't intentional, and oftentimes doesn't start out that way at all, even if it was just done innocently, the fact is, if it's a significant, I'm going to change that and say if it's a non-de minimis encroachment, Massachusetts recognizes that the homeowner, the landowner, is entitled to have any encroachments removed. And removed, we're talking about torn down, unless the encroachment is de minimis. It says here that there will be times where you can, it says in rare cases, and there'd be exceptional cases, some courts of equity have refused to grant a mandatory injunction and have left the plaintiff to his remedy of damages where the unlawful encroachment has been made innocently and the cost of removal by the defendant would be greatly disproportionate to the injury to the plaintiff from its continuation, or there's ways to protect that person's interests without an injunction. But this is the very rare or exceptional case in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has very strong laws with respect to, a man's home is his castle. For an invasion like this, you're entitled to have it removed by way of an injunction, and the court would order this removed. The defendants have a couple defenses. One of them is, well, we have done this long enough that it's adverse possession. The court makes quick work of that because, as I told you, you cannot have adverse possession claims against registered land in Massachusetts. It's the law. Registered land gives that person greater title and greater assurances as to what their land is. And this is not a de minimis encroachment. If you look at notes 3 and I think it's on page 270, that a de minimis means a minor or insignificant encroachment. Inches, not as many square feet as this is. If you think about it, maybe a fire escape, you could argue, that's vitally necessary in the north end. Maybe a de minimis because it's needed badly, and how big is the encroachment. But if you look at these cases in the notes, they're talking like sometimes a pipe, maybe if we're looking at what are those called? From the gutter, the down pipe and the like. If it's inches, that's encroaching. If it is an air conditioning unit, that might extend over. But it's got to be de minimis in Massachusetts. Otherwise, if we're talking about an encroachment of this nature, then the law in Massachusetts is clear that you're entitled to have that trespassing structure removed, because the law heavily favors the right of the landowner to be able to have their property unimpeded with these trespassing properties, regardless of whether it was done innocently or not. It says that in order to be a de minimis encroachment, it must be small or slight. You look at 271, it talks about injunction refused where encroachment was upon a 6-inch strip of land and removal would involve a large expense. In order for it to fall within de minimis, it's got to be a relatively tiny encroachment and the harm to the plaintiff is insignificant. The fact is here that that's not what this case is. 10% of that lot is occupied by this property. It's going to be removed. And here's what's astonishing, well, maybe astonishing about it. Even if that's the only bathroom in the house on that 465 square feet structure of the encroachment, and even if, and this is a possibility too in beach communities, that when you remove that bathroom, there may be nowhere else on that lot to put it, which would really render the property completely unusable. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If it's not a de minimis encroachment, even if it renders the other property useless, in Massachusetts, the landowner is entitled to mandatory removal of the offending structure. And it happens with much more regularity than you'd think. Pools, sheds, you know, a lot of times people do things that they shouldn't without thinking, and the fact is these problems oftentimes do come up. Driveways are common. You name it, there's a lot of times where this is done. Usually it's not done with such a significant part of the building being on the other land, but that's what was done here, and the plaintiff is entitled to that injunction to get it to be removed. Questions on it? Then let's talk about Boomer versus Atlantic Cement. So, nuisance. Because these landowners want an injunction preventing the owner of the cement plant from emitting dust and raw materials and excessive blasting, and they want damages for the past injury as well. Dirt, smoke, vibration emanating from the defendant's cement plant. Defendant had invested in excess of $45 million, and over 300 people were employed in the plant. And so the question is this a nuisance, first of all? And if it's a nuisance, what can be done about it? But if you think about it, and this is, and I want you to think about it, obviously, cement plants, sewage treatment facilities, Manchester Airport up in New Hampshire, which started out as a little tiny airport, now all of a sudden it's a major commercial hub. There's a lot of, we have what's it called? Not that we have a sewage treatment plant in North Andover. We also have a trash burning facility that both of which have people have complained about from time to time. All of those things, we need, right? We need in order to build our cities, and we need cement plants, and they need to be close by to populated areas because that's how commerce works. We need to treat our sewerage, but no one wants it treated next door to their house. We need to get rid of our trash, and one way they do it oftentimes is burning it, but no one wants to be too close to those stacks either, or downwind from the stacks. And so how do we balance the interests of the society to grow and to use these services, and at the same time worry about nuisance with respect to the surrounding area? So these issues come up all the time. And as you might guess, and I think just from looking at it, if you think about, well, if you were living next to a cement plant or a quarry or any type of industrial use like that, well, there's going to be significant interference with your use and enjoyment of that property, right? And so does that constitute a public nuisance? And does it constitute a private nuisance for those that are close enough to it that it's even affecting them to a greater degree? We have to think that that's probably likely. Here in this case, it says a nuisance has been found after trial. Temporary damages have been allowed, but an injunction has been denied. So the court recognized that these were likely going to interfere with the use and enjoyment of the land. And which, by the way, though, right, says this injury to property from dirt, smoke, and vibration, supporting Ray's point that a lot of these things would be nuisance as opposed to trespass. I don't know about dirt and smoke. Vibration, I might agree with Ray. Dirt and smoke are entering my land then. I think that this could be a trespass as well. But by the way, we don't have to pick one or the other. What I'm just suggesting to you, and when I've had them, I pled both. You know why? I don't want to have someone later on say, no, you should have pled trespass. It's another couple pages in the complaint, right? Again, a lot of what I'm trying to preach at times is to sort of use a belt and suspenders approach, because then I've covered it. Worst case, I've been redundant by a couple of pages. Best case, only one of the two applied, and my initial gut was plead one, but now looking at the discovery and everything else, it may be to a greater extent that it's a trespass as opposed to a nuisance. And again, a lot of times they're close. At any rate, by the way, for those of you that head to Boston, you ever see Boston Sand and Gravel right at North Station there, right? And I've always thought that now it hadn't been a problem for years. Now there are two huge apartment complexes or condo complexes going up. There's a couple on the other corner. My guess is that we're going to start to hear those neighbors complain a little more as well, because you don't spend whatever they're spending for rent or the condos and then have these big cement trucks that get moving at like 6 a.m., emit a lot of dust and vibration just from their movement. When the condos were developed in South Boston at the old Gillette plant, because part of the Gillette plant was going to continue to be used as a manufacturing facility, what they did is they wrote right into the deeds that that part of this complex would continue to function as a manufacturing facility with all its attendance problems, and listing them all, so that no owner could come in and say, well, we didn't know, and that now we want to shut it down or we want damages. So they made it part of a restriction and part of, in essence, like a lien against the land, that there were commercial activities taking place that would interfere with the use and enjoyment of the land. In essence, you're welcome to come in, but you don't get to come in to the country and complain about the cow manure, because that's what comes with the cow manure. Well, at Gillette, they did the reverse. They said, okay, you empty nesters who want to come into the city, recognize that the city has other issues that would fall into nuisance and the like as well. You're welcome to come, but come and don't think you're going to sit there in the quiet suburbs, because the city has nuisance issues that you have to get used to as well. At any rate, here, these folks want an injunction which would prevent the use of the plant for making the cement, would mean that these people ultimately, at the end of the day, would lose their jobs. And so the question is, what can the court do with respect to this situation? Because there's significant interest on both sides of this. This is not an easy solution. One, as they said here, one way to think about this, and this is what we have to think about as we start to argue injunctive relief and what the remedy should be. It said one thing to do is to grant the injunction, but to postpone its effect to a future date, to give them time to either, try to bring their plant into compliance with various restrictions so it doesn't interfere with the use and enjoyment of the property. But at least let them know that in 6 months, a year, or 2 years' time, this is what has to take place, or you will be out of business, or at least gives them time to look for another place where they may be further away from someone who's going to be claiming that the smoke and the dust that is emitting from the plant is interfering with them. It also, as it says here, gives them an opportunity for technical advances to permit defendant to eliminate the nuisance. Again, the trash burning facility near us has had problems like that, where people say there's high levels of mercury that are emitting from the stacks. Well, they can put scrubbers, they can do things. At the same time, we got to get rid of the trash. Maybe a solution like this that gives them time to come into compliance, to get the better technology in place. And the court, because of its equitable powers, has some opportunity there to be able to craft an order that works for everyone. Now, another thing potentially here they could do, and this is what they're thinking about, is, and it's on the top of page 278, it says that if this nuisance is of a permanent and unabatable character, so you can argue that it can't be repaired in essence, then what they can do, and especially where the social utility of the activity is high, as it would be here, as it would be with a trash burning facility, as it would be with a sewage treatment plant, as it would be, the argument would be made for an airport as well, that a single recovery can be had, including the whole damage past and the future diminution in value to that property. So in essence, instead of enjoining the nuisance, we'll give you a one-time award of damages, recognizing both the past damage and the diminution in value to your property as a result of this nuisance that is not going to be abated, but is going to exist. Like the sewage treatment plant, come June and the early part of July, when I drive up Sutton Street, I'm going to smell poop. And if I lived near that, I would be lousy for 6 weeks or so. And it's probably not those 6 weeks. It certainly would be July and August. I know we have to do something about it, but why does it have to be right next to my house? So I could see, but the fact is that has to be somewhere, and we're going to see in the other cases, maybe the court can structure, there are things to do along those lines. So there's one of the things they're saying, permanent damages are allowed when the loss recoverable would obviously be small as compared with the cost of the removal of the nuisance. So, we've seen it around airports where they try to work with folks, but at some point, Logan Airport is not going to shut down. And at some point, there's only so much noise we can cut out of it, that at some point, a permanent award of damages for those people that are that affected by it, so such that it goes onto the property and it carries with it to the new owner. So the new owner is aware that this is a permanent grant of damages, and that becomes, as it says here, a servitude on the land imposed by defendant's nuisance, that we need the value of this activity, but we have to recognize the plaintiff's rights have been affected. The problem with this method of solution, it's a possibility, but it's again, what you're really balancing is that social utility. If it is just someone's private interest and the like, that's not likely going to carry the day, certainly not in Massachusetts. But when the value of whatever is causing the nuisance has a significant societal value, well, then we have to weigh whether your nuisance truly should trump the value to whatever that facility is for that we all need. And so there can be an award of damages on a permanent basis like that, depending on the social utility of the nuisance. Take a look at Pate versus City of Martin, which is another nuisance case and the like. And this is, to me, an interesting solution to it. So the landowners here are seeking an abatement of the nuisance and damages to real property against the city's operation of a sewerage lagoon. He said that, at least initially, that it was a permanent nuisance, which permanent, by the way, means not repairable. Well, the fact is there may be steps that could make it repairable, but that's the difference between permanent and temporary. Permanent is not repairable, temporary is. Also, the difference would be statute of limitations issues. If it's permanent, then it runs from the time you should have discovered it, and it's a 3 years. Nuisance is a tort. In Massachusetts, it's 3 years. If it's a temporary nuisance, meaning it's fixable, then each new day is a new violation, so the statute of limitations runs anew every day, because a temporary nuisance is repairable. So here what they're saying is that I'm just going to award damages and because it's a permanent nuisance, and the plaintiffs didn't really show their damage here. Let me ask you that. What would you show for damages? So let's suppose you live on Sutton Street near the sewage treatment plant in North Andover, and July and August, you can't use your decks. You can't really leave the windows open because you smell, and it's enough to make you sick. So what are your damages? Go ahead.
Well, the use and enjoyment of your land, but
Okay,
how
but-
would you quantify that?
Yeah.
Would be how much you use your land on a daily basis. I mean, what you use your land for.
Well, in July and August around here, our summer's short. You like to be out on the deck grilling and enjoying the sun and.
So I would probably look at your utility bill, because you have to keep the windows closed, that means that it's getting hot.
What if I don't have air conditioning? Can I make you pay for central air?
Well, I think that's a stretch, maybe.
Why?
Oh, no, let me rephrase, it's not a stretch, because if you can't use it, then it's too much.
Because that's going to make my electricity bill go up now.
Wouldn't it be
Would-
worse if you didn't have AC because you were using, like, let's say you're using a window unit and the air from the outside, and you'd have to,
Oh, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, if you have a window unit, the windows aren't completely insulated, so the smell's gonna come in that much worse.
So I need central air.
Just sucking in the poopy air.
That's what I mean, and let's say you have children, like, you're not gonna bring your child outside to smell cow manure, so what, you're gonna have to join, I don't know, a little Y perhaps, I don't know.
Oh, so I can join Cedar
No,
Dale
I'm
and go
just
there summer.
saying.
They have some nice
Like,
pools.
What are you supposed to do, keep your kid inside all day?
I'm with you, so I'm just trying to figure out what my damages are, because I was thinking you were just going to tell me, well, rental value for the 2 months, whatever the house would cost.
No, it's more than that.
It's more than that.
Yeah, it's your use and enjoyment. So whatever.
Okay, but but you
quantify
need to
that.
quantify it, and that's,
Right.
remember, this is where the rubber
So
meets the
kids,
road.
For instance, if you had kids, you'd put in the daycare costs for the child. And
Because they can't stay in the house. Now they've got to go to
Now they
Brooks
have
for
to go
summer
somewhere
camp.
else, right?
Yeah, right? So I can go, so they got to spend the summer at Brooks.
I don't know what Brooks is.
Oh, Brooks is a really nice private school on the lake, but they have this great summer camp program.
It has to be
Boats and
reasonable.
pools and,
I mean,
what do you mean reasonable? There's a camp over near me in Merrimack that it's like kids could spend the whole summer there. Some kids do. Like,
The place can't be like $1,000 a day though.
oh, it's not a day.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, that whole word reasonable, I mean, it could be reasonable to him to want to spend that. You know, that's what he does every day, because he's been doing this for all these years, you know, so, quantify, I don't know how to.
Well, see, I'm not, the houses in this area are smaller. The likelihood is the folks come from a less affluent socioeconomic background, but those are the houses they could afford. But so now, you were saying, well, so you can't send your kid to summer camp because it's my fault. I mean, I'm the one that caused, or the town, because it's actually a sanitary district. They caused the problem. Shouldn't they then be prepared to pay what their damages are to solve that problem? And I hear you. I'm surprised at camp. Like, I thought with central air, you could play games in the house, couldn't you? You could go down to the park somewhere.
That's true.
No?
Well, it
'Cause-
depends on if the central air still has the smell in it or not.
Well, so I need central air and a destinkifier with
Well, I
that,
mean-
right? No, I'm with you. Okay. But is that a fair ask?
I think it's unreasonable.
No diminution in rental value? Houses in North Andover rent for $2,000. You're not really getting a $2,000 rental, you're getting a $1,000 rental. Could that be a measure of the damages?
Well, potentially, but you'd have to make a substantial argument that why it caused this diminution.
Well, See, to me, I could live with that. I can live with that. I think that's a pretty easy make. That if the average rental value is $2,000, who would live there unless they had to smell that? And seriously, there'll be like 6 weeks where it's got to be pretty bad. Now, it's gotten better, by the way, because in part, I think they're a little more creative than they were. But for the longest while, it was like, who cares? This, live with it. Just like people do with the airport, just what they say with the cement plants and everything else. Listen, and part of it is the argument, you came here. You should have known. Now you're stuck with it. So Pate versus City of Martin, they want to do something about this, and legitimately, this is not a minor inconvenience. But it talks about the difference between temporary nuisance and permanent, and that's why I need you to start to think about that. As it says here, temporary nuisance is a nuisance which can be corrected by the expenditure of labor or money. Okay? Now, again, I'll just come back to North Andover. At one point, they were saying, yes, it can be corrected by labor or money. What that would mean is capping these lagoons, and that's going to cost $10 million. And that's what everyone said, oh, screw it then. $10 million, we're not paying for that. Let these people put up with it who live nearby. Well, it's easy for you to say because you don't smell it 24/7 like they. But a temporary nuisance is a nuisance which can be corrected by the expenditure of labor or money, which almost sounds like these days, I mean, you put enough money behind it, you should be able to fix virtually anything, couldn't you, with money and technology these days? At any rate, so it says measure of damages for a temporary nuisance is the injury to the value of the use and enjoyment of the property, which is usually shown by the evidence of the extent that the rental value of the property is diminished by the nuisance. That seems to be a more traditional measure of damages here than Brook Summer Camp and all the rest of it, and the movie passes to and the like. So you might want to think a little bit about that. Here, what they did is he found that it was permanent and awarded $10,000 in damages. In essence, a diminution in market value of the property. So if the house would have gone for 100, we're saying your house is only worth 90 because of its proximity to this nuisance, which is the sewerage lagoon. Let's see. A nuisance has been defined as anything which annoys or disturbs the free use of one's property or which renders its ordinary use or physical occupation uncomfortable. It was said that a nuisance extends to everything that endangers life or health or gives offense to the senses, the sound and light and smells that we talked about, to the laws of decency or obstructs the reasonable and comfortable use of the property. So that's the nuisance. So the question is this a nuisance in fact? Now listen, if you read the case, it said that at one point they were able to diminish the smells and the problem by putting a guy in a little powerboat out there who rode around the sewerage lagoons with this little outboard. So I want you to remember this case when you think about how crappy your job is, whatever that job is, and think about what if you were the guy running the little motorboat around the sewerage lagoons. If these poor people can't live in their house, what's it like in that boat as he's churning through the lagoons full of poop? But we all gotta work, right? And this was his job. So your job can't possibly be anything near that. But what they said is, and again, this is sort of the creativity that equity asked for, that law school often tries to beat out of you guys, that, well, why can't we be creative with the solution so that everyone can live with it? And here, this was a pretty good solution that they just decided to abandon when it certainly would have been more to the liking of these plaintiffs. So maybe that's something they ought to rethink about. Where the nuisance is temporary, damages to property affected by the nuisance are recurrent and may be recovered from time to time until the nuisance is abated. So this is not one of these, I sue once on a temporary nuisance, and then I'm stuck with whatever happens at that. If the nuisance continues, I can sue again, and I can sue again, and I can sue again for those damages. Each new day of a temporary nuisance is a new violation, and the statute of limitations, as do the damages, run again. And so here, this really is a temporary nuisance because they have been able to repair it in the past. This is not a permanent nuisance, and what they should be obtaining is the rental value of the property, which has been diminished as a result of the nuisance, and therefore that's their appropriate measure of damages under the circumstances. You've got one last case here, and that's Myers versus Arnold, and it again asks you to measure damages for invasions of one's land. So is this case a trespass or a nuisance? She had asked for some fill to the property, and because she was going to build another residence on the property, and they had a big road construction project, and instead of getting what she says she asked for is a relatively one truckload, a relatively minor amount of fill, they took truckload upon truckload upon truckload to her property, such that the concrete concrete had reinforcing rods, and it was concrete as well, was stacked 8 feet high and covered an area approximately 50 by 150 feet. And lo and behold, it had been placed exactly where the plaintiffs intended to build their second house. Mrs. Meyer immediately contacted the company. They refused to remove it. Okay. We've got to figure out what the value to the injury here is, what her damages and remedy would be. There's a bunch of different figures they throw out here to think about. First of all, she's the value of each acre, and she's got some of this property now is useless with all this concrete on it. She has about 20-something acres. The appraiser testifies that the value was about $750 an acre. Might have been $650 an acre. The defendant would be more than happy to give them $600-700 and move on, because she's saying, no, this is repairable, and what I want is the $18,200, which would be the cost to remove all this concrete, assuming I can find someone to take it. Those are the appropriate measure of my damages, is to put it back in the position it would have been before. The court goes through various instructions here with respect to what this measure of damages should be. One thing they say, it's the lesser of the reasonable expense of the repairs, so put it back in the position to what it should have been, or the difference between the fair market value of the property before the occurrence minus the fair market value immediately after, right? Sort of the diminution in value argument. The damage award ultimately was $12,000, which represented the cost to repair. They want the cost to repair because it's larger. If, in fact, they simply were not going to build a piece of property there, the argument that she should be limited to the value of the land, which is $600 or $700, makes a lot more sense. The problem is she's saying, no, that's precisely where we were going to build our home, and so that's not going to do it. We want $12,000 to $18,000, which is the cost of restoring that property to the condition it was in. Now, whether that's true or not, that's an argument for another time. If you give me $18,000 and I've got 20 acres of land, I'm gonna figure out somewhere else to build that house and pocket 18 grand to build the house. But her testimony is that's her land, that she wants to restore it, that's where she wanted to build her home, her castle. And the law here is gonna say that she gets then the value of the cost to replace it. When a landowner has showed that he has suffered a compensable injury, they've got to determine what the harm is in order to fully compensate the plaintiff for that harm. And either it's the lesser of the cost of repair or the diminution in market value, where the interest is financial, where if there was a person who was in the business of selling lots of land, that's one thing. But here, when it's your home, as it says here on page 321, 285, that it's not going to be enough unless we put it back into the position it would have been, but for the injury that the defendant suffered upon them. And the rule that they adopt here is, and it's on the second column of page 321 in the original case, 285, it says, you got to look at the difference between permanent and temporary conditions like this. Permanent means it can't be fixed, okay? But this is not something that can't be fixed. Yes, it's expensive and the diminution is maybe relatively modest. The rule which the court adopted requires whether the injury is permanent or non-permanent. If permanent, the measure of damage is the market value of the realty before the injury, less its market value after. Where it's non-permanent, it's her home, she's entitled to have it put back into the position it would have been prior to. Then the cost to remove all this concrete, what she wants is the $18,000, the much higher money. The plaintiff or the defendant, $600 or $700, the value of the acre's no good. $500, the value of what this would have been cost to dump it somewhere else is no good. They're going to have to restore her property to the condition it was, but for the violation of the law. So the fact is that they're going to pay the much higher price because this trespass is fixable. That's what she gets.